This episode contains discussions of attempted sexual assault.
Prologue, 1969. Marsh is not swamp. Marsh is a space of light, where grass grows in water, and water flows into the sky. Slow-moving creeks wander, carrying the orb of the sun with them to the sea, and long-legged birds lift with unexpected grace, as though not built to fly, against the roar of 1,000 snow geese.
Welcome to the Professor's Bookshelf. I'm Linda Davis.
And I'm Paige Duffy.
And today we are discussing Delia Owens' Where the Crawdads Sing. My name is Linda Davis. I'm currently a professor of English. I graduated from Texas Christian University, and my dissertation, Infected Regions, Marriage Metaphors, and Illness Plots in Antebellum Cross-Regional Fiction, focuses on pre-Civil War novels, in which I view cross-regional marriages as metaphors for national unity, playing on the double-voiced discourse of union in marriage union and national unity.
And I am Paige K. Duffy. I am also currently a professor of English. I graduated from Southern New Hampshire University with a degree in creative writing, so my dissertation was the first 30K so of an original fiction novel that I'm still working on rearranging, but I am mostly focused on both literary analysis and interpretation of works as queer literature. And so today we're talking about Where the Crawdads Sing, and that's going to get us into the baseline of a book focusing. We have our main character, Kya, who is a girl who grows up in the marsh of North Carolina. She ends up having to raise herself after being abandoned by her family, and later, whenever she grows up into being a young woman, she is accused of a murder, and the book kind of intertwines these two plot lines together.
Right. She was, her mother left at 6, and her father left at 10, so she looks to the marsh as a mother, and the marsh actually raises her. She raises herself by observing the animals and insects and flora and fauna in the marsh, which is extremely interesting.
Yeah. So since this is our season where we're focusing on banned books, this book is kind of an interesting one in that it's got a more limited scope of being banned, but several public schools struggled whether or not Crawdads should be part of their school library. So we have this book does deal with some adult content. We have exploration of sexuality as a young woman, and then we also have, there is an attempted rape scene that ties in there. So there's been a lot of questions on, is this a book that's appropriate for children of high school level? And it's just like, okay, where do we draw that line has been a lot of the conversation of like, okay, but well, high school seniors perhaps are 18 and they can do things like they can vote, they can buy cigarettes, they can
go to war.
They
can buy adult magazines. Yeah.
Yes. So it's just like, okay, at what point are we taking books out of high school libraries? And some libraries, I believe you were concluded that this book will stay there, but students would still need parental permission to take it out in the first place.
So, yes, parents need to sign a paper in order for them to check the book out. And I find it really interesting that they ban it on those grounds because there is a rape scene, right? And I think that it's treated very carefully in the book, but I think it's also important that rape happens, and it's important to read these works and see how these people handle it. Now, Kaya, the sexual part of the banning is because of the sexual content, and I think one thing that's really interesting is that when the male character who is trying to seduce her, she actually stands her ground, and she makes him wait a whole year before they consummate, and as a result, they form a relationship. And I think he does, in a way, fall in love with her, and he goes through the trouble of, their first night, making it not as special as she wanted it to be, but, he did try better than he would have if she would have succumbed to him in the beginning. So I think her standing her ground and making that moment where she gives herself to him on her terms is very important to the novel and a very important lesson for women.
Yeah,
or young women.
There's a lot of scenes too with like not just necessarily that character, but the other character that's I guess he's primary. The
Tate.
Tate. The Tate. There's just like there's a lot of things where they're like slowly coming together of like, okay, now we're starting to get into being more intimately involved, but there's a lot of like respect of boundaries that is shown, and I think that really does emphasize later in the book whenever Chase is unwilling to respect those boundaries, that it ends up having a really big effect on how those themes have been played throughout. What you said is important for young women to see, like, respectful boundaries, what's not respectful boundaries. And within the context of, like, bans, this is a really interesting concept where we're dealing with even a restriction of books of, like, oh, you're only allowed to have it under these circumstances, is kind of a, well, maybe not like a widespread ban entirely, is still a really interesting thing of like, well, how do we determine who's allowed to see what content,
Right.
in what areas, and also at what point do we start limiting that content? So it's like you said, within this case, a high school library, you have, okay, maybe I could, with like younger teens that are freshmen in high school, maybe requiring parental permission out of them makes a little bit more sense, possibly, depending on how you want to arrange that. But in these, for like, again, high school seniors who are officially adults, like, at what point do we need to, or rather, at what point is there a perceived need to restrict what people are reading? So,
Right, yes, I totally understand that. One other aspect of the book that might be disturbing and might cause it to be banned is it deals with marital violence.
mm-hmm.
So not only does Kaya have to deal with that, witness it with her father hitting her mother, punching her mother, so that she has a black eye, swollen eye, that is mirrored later between the
mm-hmm.
relationship of Chase and Kaya,
mm-hmm.
where he, in the rape scene, he punches her, and she hides it like most women do,
mm-hmm.
and she's even questioning the hiding of it. She strategically hides so people don't see her, and then she decides when she does go out in public, have the bruises healed enough for her to be able to convince them she hit her face on a door or something. But that is something that is a controversial topic within the book, is marital violence, but it is something that happens, and we have to recognize that women deal with this, and how do they resolve it, how do they negotiate it, how do they resolve it.
Mm-hmm. And I found it really interesting too within the sequence where she's like initially being like, hey, when she's like recognizing, she's like, oh, this is really weird that I want to hide this. Like, it's the effect of shame, which is
mm-hmm.
another really important topic of like being able to recognize like how shame impacts your actions, and it just like restricts you in ways that you shouldn't, or it's just like she should feel able to admit to somebody else what happened and at least like get comfort and help. But of course that ties into Kaya as a character too, because so much of her is she's been left alone so many times, and that she wants to trust, but she feels like in these cases, both with Tate and Chase, in different ways of like, oh, I trusted and opened to you, and I left myself vulnerable, and that tore me apart whenever either Tate ends up deciding to go away to college and be away for a while,
mm-hmm.
and choosing other aspects of his life over her for a while, and then of course Chase and himself with the attempted rape scene. And so that all just like, and even before that, where it's just like he's sleeping with her, but he's engaged to somebody else.
With Chase, yes.
Yeah.
That's the okay. Can we talk about the sneaky fuckers?
Oh yeah.
There's at one point she educates herself, which I find very fascinating about her character. She must be of a character of high intelligence to be able to teach her. Well, of course, Tate teaches her to read, but that's all he does. He gives her the books, and she does everything herself. And she picks up this book about sneaky fuckers, about, I don't remember if it was just animals and insects and gender. There's the male of what she calls higher mass, which he's the guy she likened to Chase, with revving up his car and having the speedboat and the attraction of all the ladies. And so the male with the higher mass goes in, and all the women want to mate with him because he's the stronger male, and the insects and the animals that are produced as a result of the mating have the territory of the ground, have the greater territory of the ground. But since there's so many women mating with or waiting to mate with the male of higher mass, the weaker males come up and they're waiting. They jump on one of the ladies waiting for the animal or the insect, and so this book had titled them "Sneaky Fuckers." And I was just wondering your opinion, Paige, if you saw Tate as a sneaky fucker, because if you think about it, he's waiting in the wings for her while she's with Chase, and I don't want to see Tate in a negative light, but
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I think, like, especially because Tate is there first, and they do kind of have this, like, growing up together thing that adds to their building on there, which I don't necessarily. It's a very similar parallel, but I don't think he's necessarily doing it to harm, in that he's just trying to respect what she's, like, chosen to do, which is, of course, part of an important, like, distinction between these two relationships, where he's just like, well, I wish you would choose me, but when she's like, I can't because you've.
and then that brings up the idea, well, maybe he's the higher mass intellectually, and Chase is the sneaky fucker who comes in after the main guy has left and takes advantage of that broken heart that has been left behind, and she's lonely. And as she says very many times throughout the novel, everybody leaves her in the end, and she totally expects that out of every person, which is very sad.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because I think that's interesting, because I definitely have had characters I've written from that perspective before. So seeing that in another character is just like, and you can't blame her either. Like, she's like, her mother walked out, and then it's just like all her siblings, one by one, who are older than her, they slowly, like, end up leaving, or there's even ones where she doesn't clearly remember because they left before she was even old enough to.
Yeah, you never hear about them again.
Yeah, except for, like, the paintings at the end, where it's just like, she's just like, oh, I know their names, but I can't recognize their faces because I don't have any memory of them. So
that's a really good lesson for young people too, is how do they deal with isolation? How do they deal with abandonment? And how do they pick themselves up by their bootstraps and go on with life and make a success of life for themselves on their own terms, which she constantly does. She does that with relationships. She does that with her publications, with her studies. Everything's done. Even her, there's a little bit of a disclaimer here. We might reveal something here, but even in the court scene in the end, in her decisions there, on to remain silent, because silence is her shell. And there's a lot in there of equating her with somebody hiding in a shell, and she says people always forget about those living within shells. But silence seems to be her protection, her hiding, her staying silent, her tucking her head, going forward, not making eye contact. That's her survival.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of other scenes earlier too, where she's just like, she hears other boats coming, or she's just like, oh, that's Tate's boat, I'm not ready to deal with him, I'm going to tuck away from that. And of course there's so many scenes, like, even in her childhood leading up, where people are coming to her house, and she's trying to, like, well, either, like, you have the truant officer whenever she's younger, and she like has this traumatic experience of her first day of school, so she's like, well, I'm not doing that anymore. And so you have a lot of her running away from that, but then she even ends up running away from characters like Tate, who do care for her, but she's just so emotionally raw after being abandoned. She's like, I can't deal with that. And of course, after Chase's assault, she's also very much like, I'm avoiding him. And even all the way to the end, where she's avoiding, because part of the book is there's the murder that she ends up being accused of. So, like, she's even, like, spending so much time avoiding even getting taken in by the cops for.
She's constantly in danger. Constantly. Since she was 6 years old when her mother left, she was in danger of her father. Then all of her brothers and sisters left, and she's in danger of the townspeople. And then she becomes in danger of the males. Even at a young age, she would hear males talking about her and wondering what it would be like to, have relations with her, I guess is the sensitive way of saying that. And it reminds me of that scene, Paige, I don't know if you remember it, with the turkey hen, and it was caught up into something and was trapped, and it couldn't escape. And the other hens, or the other turkeys, started attacking, a member of their own tribe, a member of their own flock, and they're attacking it and they're killing it. And she explains it in the novel, is that the trapped hen makes the whole tribe vulnerable. And so it would attract, like, a hawk or somebody who would get the turkey, so they had to kill it for their own protection. And you kind of wonder if that is an allegory for the town seeing her as different and seeing her as that hen who's vulnerable, and they want to attack her for maybe they see her as a threat to them.
Yeah, because she's talked about like you said with the teenage boys and whatnot, but even throughout the entire thing, she gets this sort of like mythical aspect to her because she is like out there living by herself in the marsh. So she's called the marsh girl from a lot of outside perspective, where it's just like they're just like, we don't know what to do, because she only really interacts with people to go and get what shopping that she needs to take care of, and she does like have her sort of safe relationship with Jumpin', who helps like provide gas for the boat and sort of those sorts of things. But even with other essential places, she doesn't really bond with with other people that she regularly interacts with, just because she has that sense of isolation. And then there's other people who aren't there to like there's the scene where it's talking about like they kind of have like teenage boys with this test of courage of like, we're gonna run up to the marsh girl Dora's house and like bang on the door. And so she kind of gets turned into, from the like outsider's perspective, because of course we, as reading the novel, we see a lot of her perspective, so we obviously, she is a person and we learn about all her humanity, but they kind of see her as this strange other that they can't quite comprehend, and to the point that they're like, oh, let's go knock on the door and create some sort of issue, but just like see if we can survive the marsh girl's home or whatever. And it's just like, and then it's just like, well, somebody, and then like you said, they're like, oh, if maybe what would it be like to have sex with her, is like be the one who is able to have sex with the marsh girl. And then of course, even whenever we get to the murder case, we have like, they're just like, well, okay, like if we gotta suspect someone, just like they're this isolated person that nobody really has, or at least like very few people actually understand as another person.
I like how you bring up that she's the marsh girl, because the marsh is a character in and of itself within the novel. Owens begins the novel with a prologue where she is defining marsh versus swamp. Marsh is defined in terms of light and sun, which are symbolic of knowledge and wisdom. And then when she gets to swamp, it's all dark and death. And the chapter where they find the dead body is actually called The Swamp, which is really interesting. But this idea of the swamp, she later says that, Kaya says that the swamp is her mother. Her mother says that the swamp is her family. And the swamp is what protects her constantly. That's where she hides. So she learns about life through nature. She learns to deal with her mother's abandonment by something her brother tells her about the fox, that whenever the fox, by the way, this is what I would call a Bogensroman novel, which is a coming-of-age novel where a young woman learns to mature. But her brother tells her about this story of this fox, and that the fox is at the point where it's a she fox, and she realizes that she's in a situation where she cannot survive, and she has children, baby foxes. And she has to leave in order for her own self-survival, even if it means that her children are going to die. And this idea of the fox comes up over and over and over. She's actually referred to as a she-fox, so maybe she's the kit of the fox who left. But this idea of self-survival. And then, again, she brings up talking about the fireflies. You remember the deal about the fireflies, and whenever she started studying them and noticed they were giving off this Morse code type light. And it was really funny, and to me, and it's the scene where she describes watching this female firefly, and what they do is they send out this certain Morse code light saying, I'm ready to mate. And then a male fly would come over and they would mate. She saw some of the females would give a sign, I'm ready to mate, and when the male comes over, they quickly change their signal and they eat the fly. They eat the male fly, and she talks about the praying mantis too, and there's this line in there that she says, every creature does what it must to survive. And for me, that kind of paralleled what comes later in the novel when she has to make decisions about how she will survive. And she does not make those decisions based on a social code in the human world. She makes those decisions based on a social code in the animal kingdom, in the insect world. And I think that's one really interesting thing about the novel, is that the marsh is her mother, is her family. It also taught her. She learned about life by watching what comes natural in the flora and fauna.
Yeah. And especially I also like to backtrack a little bit. I like what you said is just like the marsh is what helps her survive. And I think that really helps play into too, because a part of like how she gets a lot of her livelihood later is that eventually she does get this opportunity to publish these books of all these like paintings and studies she's done of the marsh life that's going on there. So that's like, there's a lot of the nature aspect of it, but even like, I think that kind of adds to the power of the marsh. That's just like the marsh isn't just teaching her all these things about like nature and how they all function together, but it's also giving her an opportunity to survive in the more like structured society of what by providing her like she gets a lot of especially for the time period the book is set in, a substantial amount of royalties and stuff out of these books. That's like she's able to buy her chunk of the land. She's able to do the conservation thing where it's just like, well, if she pays all this like taxes that are owed on it with the money that she gets from her books, and she's like, well, now I can pay nature back by conserving this sort of place too. So there's a lot of things that are just like,
yeah, and the marsh is known traditionally for protecting peoples. You know, so there's the Maroons, there's escaped slaves. We have Harriet Beecher's novel, Stowe's novel, Dread, in which there's a lot of escaped slaves who live in the marsh. Mm-hmm. So the marsh is a protecting type nature, is a mother to her. I find this extremely so. What do you think, Paige? You think that you'd recommend this for high school students or even college students?
Yeah, I think like you were talking about, there's a lot of really important things of like, you were talking about how there's a lot of really important aspects where it's like lessons for young women to learn, or even like, it's very easy to say like, oh, young women can learn like things from this, but also like anyone can learn like, hey, this is what a respectful boundary looks like, even just like this is the respective relationships here. So I think there's a lot of really interesting aspects in it that let you look at the world through a different lens, but are still applicable. So, and there's a lot of beautiful writing and imagery and stuff in it too.
There's a lot of, for all that she is a victim and constantly a victim, she stands her ground on every area with family. She's vocal to her brother Jody. You left me. She told him several times, you left me alone. She calls him to account for that. She stands up to Tate, and she stands up to Chase. And in a sense, she stands up to the townspeople, but on her own terms.
Yeah.
And I find that she's an extremely interesting character and worthy of study.
Yes, for sure. And of course, there's even more that we could say that's about the ending of the book, but that's something you can explore by reading yourself and seeing what you think about how she pulls together.
And again, I will bring in that idea of the firefly. There's a poem at the end I want to draw your attention to whenever you guys who are listening get to the end of the novel. Slow down and read that poem about the firefly.
Then, within the marsh, here and there, True Swamp crawls into low-lying bogs, hidden in clammy forests. Swamp water is still and dark, having swallowed the light in its muddy throat. Even night crawlers are diurnal in this lair.
You've been listening to The Professor's Bookshelf, a podcast about books recommended by college professors. You can find us on Instagram as @ProfessorsBookshelf or reach out to us at professorbookshelf@gmail.com. Next time on our season of banned books, we will be discussing John Howard Griffin's Black Like Me. Stay tuned and keep reading.